Olivia Harris had always been the epitome of success. As a senior vice president at one of the top tech companies in the nation, she had spent years building her reputation and climbing the corporate ladder. Every step she took was calculated, every decision made with the precision of someone who had learned how to navigate the world of high finance and power. She walked through airports and boardrooms with an air of authority that was as natural to her as breathing. For Olivia, the world was a well-oiled machine, and she was at the helm. She made her way through the crowded terminal at LaGuardia Airport, her heels clicking purposefully on the polished floors. Dressed in a sharp, tailored suit that hugged her form just right, her blonde hair was pulled back into a severe updo, adding to the businesslike demeanor she had cultivated over the years. It was all part of the image she had built for herself. There was no room for softness in her world, only sharp edges, and it worked. Olivia had made it to the top, and she wasn't about to let anyone forget it. As she moved towards the gate for her flight to San Francisco, she scanned the faces of the other passengers, her eyes sweeping over them with a mix of curiosity and quiet disdain. It wasn't that she considered herself better than anyone else. Well, maybe she did, but it was more about maintaining control. She had earned her spot in the upper echelons of society, and she was very aware that some people simply didn't belong in the spaces she occupied. First class was one of those spaces. She had chosen this flight specifically for the comfort and prestige that came with sitting in first class. Yes, she could have flown private, but there was something about the public display of wealth that Olivia found satisfying. First class wasn't just about comfort, it was about prestige. The other passengers could watch her as she moved through the cabin, observe the way she carried herself, and know that she belonged here, that she had earned this luxury. When she finally boarded the plane, she felt the familiar sense of entitlement flood her body. As she moved down the aisle, she took in the rows of seats, her eyes calculating the best seat, the one with the best view, the perfect amount of space. But then she saw him. A young boy sitting alone by the window, his face buried in a book. Olivia froze for a moment, her eyes narrowing. The boy couldn't have been older than 8, and there he was, sitting in first class, completely unaware of the scrutiny he was under. His presence didn't belong there, not in the way Olivia had always believed people like her did. The boy, David Brooks, didn't even glance up as Olivia approached. His large brown eyes were completely focused on the pages of his book about space exploration, his small fingers turning the pages slowly and deliberately. His posture was calm, unbothered, and his face relaxed. Olivia felt a pang of irritation at the sight. She couldn't help but wonder who allowed a child like him into this space, let alone let him sit in first class. What was a child like him doing in such an exclusive area? She had paid a premium for this seat, and yet, here she was, about to spend the next several hours sitting next to a child who, in her mind, clearly didn't belong. As she reached her seat -3A, directly beside David, Olivia's discomfort only grew. She had specifically chosen a seat in the front row, hoping to avoid any disruptions. And now she was being forced to sit next to a child, someone who didn't fit her mental picture of who deserved to be in this space. She tossed her designer handbag onto the seat with a sharp motion, her frustration building. Olivia's thoughts were a mix of disbelief and disdain. How did this happen? She thought to herself, this child, this boy, is out of place here. He doesn't belong. Her eyes flicked over to him once more, scanning his simple but neat attire, a button-down shirt and khaki pants. It was nothing extravagant. It wasn't the kind of clothing she would expect in first class, not that she expected it from anyone, but especially not from someone like him. In Olivia's mind, his appearance only reinforced her thoughts that he didn't belong here. She muttered something under her breath, her voice barely audible but laced with venom. Unbelievable. She cast a quick glance at David, who still hadn't looked up, his attention entirely focused on the book in his hands. Olivia couldn't understand it. Here she was, a powerful woman in her own right, with a life carefully constructed around success, status and image, and this child, this boy, was sitting right next to her, unwittingly challenging the very concept of privilege that she held so dear. Her irritation began to bubble over. She quickly pulled out her phone, dialed the number of her best friend, Monica, and with a sigh, began to vent. Monica had always been a sounding board for her frustrations, and this situation was no different. As the plane taxied down the runway, Olivia's voice dropped to a low, almost conspiratorial tone, though loud enough for those seated nearby to hear. "Monica, you won't believe who they sat me next to on this flight," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "I can't believe this. There's literally a black child beside me in first class. Yes, a black child. And not even well-dressed. I specifically booked first class to avoid, well, people like him." Her words hung in the air, harsh and unforgiving. She glanced sideways at David, her eyes scanning him once more from head to toe, her thoughts loud and unfiltered. "He doesn't belong here. This isn't his place. He doesn't even understand what it means to be in a space like this." What she didn't know, though, was that her words weren't as private as she thought. The flight attendants, trained to recognize subtle signs of prejudice, were already noticing her discomfort. Some passengers were beginning to take note of the tension between Olivia and David, though they were hesitant to say anything. After all, Olivia was a high-powered executive. No one could quite pinpoint who was in the wrong. Not yet. But Olivia had made a mistake, one that she couldn't see coming. Her every word and action were being observed, and the consequences of her behavior would soon unfold in ways that would completely shatter the carefully constructed image she had worked so hard to build. What she didn't realize was that this flight, this seemingly ordinary flight, was going to change everything. As the minutes ticked by and the plane soared into the sky, Olivia's discomfort intensified, but David remained calm and composed, his book in hand, and his thoughts focused on the adventure awaiting him in the pages. Neither of them knew that the situation was only beginning to unfold, and what was about to happen would test both of them in ways they never expected. The hum of the plane's engines was a constant, soothing backdrop, but inside the cabin, the tension between Olivia and David had begun to simmer. As the flight took off, and the world outside the window shrank away, Olivia sat with her arms crossed, her gaze locked on the young boy beside her. She had always been someone who believed in the system, who believed that the world worked best when people knew their place. And right now, she was convinced that David's place was nowhere near her. As the plane ascended into the clouds, Olivia's thoughts began to churn. She kept casting furtive glances at David, trying to understand why he was here. He didn't belong in this space, not by her standards. Olivia had earned everything she had, from her career to the luxury of first class. She had spent years building her empire, and she was used to the luxury and exclusivity that came with it. She believed that there were some people who were simply born to be in the background, and others, like herself, who were meant to shine in the spotlight. David, on the other hand, was the antithesis of everything Olivia stood for. His presence here, in her mind, was an affront to the hard work and determination that she had put into climbing the corporate ladder. Olivia had never been one to entertain thoughts of injustice. In her world, people earned their place based on their abilities, their drive, and their wealth. People like David, in her mind, didn't fit that mold. His clothes weren't flashy enough, his manner too calm, too composed. He didn't fit the image she had in her mind of someone worthy of first class. Meanwhile, David sat quietly by the window, absorbed in his book about space exploration. He had always been a curious child, fascinated by the stars and the infinite possibilities of the universe. He wasn't concerned about the judgment being passed on him by the woman beside him. His mind was far away, in a galaxy far beyond the confines of the plane's cabin. David's father, Charles Brooks, had always encouraged him to explore his interests, to dream big, and to work hard. His father had instilled in him the belief that true worth wasn't determined by wealth or status. It was about who you were and how you treated others. David's academic achievements had earned him this flight, a reward for maintaining straight A's in an advanced academic program for gifted children. For David, this was a small gesture of recognition from his father, a chance to experience something a little more luxurious than his usual routine. But what David didn't know was that his mere presence in this space was causing a ripple effect. While he was lost in the pages of his book, Olivia's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. She couldn't stop herself from glancing at him every few moments, her thoughts growing darker with every glance. She couldn't reconcile the image of the young boy with the space he occupied. She leaned back in her seat, her thoughts becoming more pronounced. How could they allow this? She thought. How can they just put anyone in first class these days? The more she thought about it, the more frustrated she became. This child didn't belong here, not just because of his age, but because of who he was. She couldn't ignore the fact that David was black, and in her mind, that further separated him from the elite space she was accustomed to. Olivia's frustration continued to build, and she turned to her phone, dialing her friend Monica once more. She needed someone to validate her feelings, someone to agree with her, to make her believe that her discomfort was justified. Monica had always been there to listen to her complaints, to share in her frustrations. This time, though, Olivia's voice shook with a mixture of disbelief and contempt as she relayed the situation. "I can't believe it, Monica. I'm sitting next to a black child in first class," Olivia said, her voice low but sharp. "I've worked so hard to get to where I am. I don't deserve to be sitting next to someone like that. He doesn't belong here." Her words were laden with judgment, as though simply existing in this space made David undeserving of it. What Olivia didn't realize was that her words were carrying far beyond the confines of her seat. She hadn't noticed the flight attendants, who were now exchanging subtle glances, nor had she realized that a nearby passenger had overheard her conversation and was now recording it on their phone. The subtle signs of discrimination weren't lost on the attentive staff, and while they didn't immediately intervene, they made a mental note of her behavior. Meanwhile, David remained oblivious to the tension in the air. He continued to turn the pages of his book, unaware of the weight of the words being spoken about him. His thoughts were filled with the stars, with the infinite vastness of space. In that moment, he was more than just a child on a plane. He was a dreamer, a thinker, someone with the potential to go far beyond the limits of his current situation. But little did he know, his character was being tested in a way that he hadn't anticipated. The flight attendants began their rounds, offering drinks and snacks to the first-class passengers. As Tasha, one of the attendants, approached David's row, she smiled at him politely, recognizing him as the son of one of their most valued customers. She had served Charles Brooks before and knew of his reputation. Her demeanor was warm and respectful, in stark contrast to Olivia's coldness. "Would you like some apple juice, young man?" Tasha asked, her voice kind, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding. David smiled politely, nodding. "Yes, please," he replied, his voice steady. He had been taught to be respectful, even when others weren't. But just as Tasha was about to move away, Olivia spoke up. Her voice was sharp, cold. "Make sure he doesn't spill it," she snapped, her eyes never leaving the pages of her phone. "I'm wearing Armani," she added, her words dripping with disdain. Tasha's smile faltered slightly, but she nodded and handed David the juice. "Don't worry, I'm sure he'll be careful," she said softly, offering David a comforting glance before walking away. David felt the weight of Olivia's words, though he did his best to ignore them. He had been taught to rise above such comments, to hold his head high and refuse to let the ugliness of the world define him. His father had always told him, "People like her may try to bring you down, but you must always stay true to who you are." As the hours passed, the tension between Olivia and David grew. Olivia's body language was a clear signal of her discomfort. She shifted in her seat, crossing her arms tightly, refusing to acknowledge David. Meanwhile, David continued to sit quietly, his focus on his book. His posture remained composed, a stark contrast to the hostile energy emanating from Olivia's direction. The flight attendants noticed the discomfort, but there was little they could do. It was clear that Olivia was not going to back down, and the subtle racism in her words and actions was starting to seep into the cabin. The passengers, though silent, were growing increasingly aware of the situation. For David, this was just another day, another lesson in how to navigate a world that often didn't understand him. But what he didn't know was that this flight would change everything. The moment of conflict that was brewing would soon reach a boiling point, and both David and Olivia would find themselves tested in ways they had never anticipated. The power dynamics at play, class, race, privilege, were about to collide in a way that neither of them could have prepared for. As the flight continued its journey through the sky, the once tranquil atmosphere of first class had become thick with tension. Olivia remained stiff in her seat, her body language tight and unwelcoming, while David continued to sit by the window, deeply immersed in his book. The steady hum of the engine seemed louder now, almost drowning out the growing discomfort that hung in the air between the two of them. Olivia had tried, and failed, to ignore David's presence, but the sight of him remained like a splinter in her mind, making her increasingly agitated. She wasn't sure what bothered her more, the child's calm demeanor or the unshakable feeling that he didn't belong. Olivia's thoughts swirled in a blur of contradictions. Why shouldn't he be in business class? She thought bitterly. Because he doesn't fit my version of success. The thought was jarring to her, but she couldn't help it. She couldn't shake the feeling that her space, the space she had earned, was being invaded by someone who didn't deserve to be there. It wasn't just about his age or his race. It was about her carefully constructed image of what it meant to belong in a place like first class. And David Brooks, with his book about space exploration and his simple clothes, just didn't fit that image. While Olivia stewed in her discomfort, David, for his part, remained oblivious to the growing storm beside him. His thoughts were far from the plane, far from the strange woman seated next to him. He had been taught to always find peace within himself, to focus on what truly mattered, his education, his dreams, and his own path in life. Today, his father had rewarded him for his hard work with a trip in first class, a small gesture of recognition for his achievements. But David wasn't the type to let material things define his sense of self-worth. He was focused on his book, his mind racing through the cosmos, imagining distant stars, and exploring the unknown. At one point, Olivia glanced at her phone, her fingers moving rapidly as she tapped out a message. She needed to vent, to release the mounting frustration that had settled deep in her chest. She dialed Monica again, her voice low but filled with an unmistakable venom. "Monica, I can't believe this. It's ridiculous. I'm stuck next to a child in first class, a black child, no less, and not even well-dressed. Can you imagine?" Olivia's voice was laced with disgust. She wasn't even trying to hide her disdain anymore, and the words came out sharper than ever. This flight used to mean something. First class was reserved for people who've worked for it, people who've earned it, not people like him. Unbeknownst to Olivia, her words were not as private as she thought. As she spoke, a nearby passenger had been listening intently, her eyes narrowing as she took in the hate seeping from Olivia's words. The flight attendants, too, had started to take notice. Tasha, one of the attendants, was serving drinks a few rows away when she overheard the conversation. She exchanged a concerned glance with her colleague, James, who had also heard the venomous remarks. They were both well-versed in handling difficult passengers, but this was different. Olivia's comments were not just rude, they were discriminatory. David, meanwhile, remained undisturbed. He had heard similar comments before, whispered and hidden in casual conversations, but he had learned from his father that the best way to deal with prejudice was to rise above it. People like her may try to bring you down, but you are more than the color of your skin or the judgments of others. Charles Brooks had told him countless times. The words of others were theirs to carry, not his. He wasn't going to let someone like Olivia shake his sense of self. The plane continued its journey, the smooth hum of the engines a constant as the flight attendants began their rounds again. James, the senior flight attendant, stopped at Olivia and David's row, offering them both drinks. Olivia, now fully immersed in her own sense of superiority, couldn't help but let her disdain slip through again. As James offered David a juice, Olivia snapped, "Make sure he doesn't spill it." Her voice was sharp, her eyes still focused on her phone, but her tone was meant to make David feel small. "I'm wearing Armani. I can't afford to have anything ruined." David, though a little taken aback by the sharpness of her words, simply nodded and took the juice from James. "Thank you," he said politely, keeping his voice steady. "Don't let it get to you," he thought, his father's words echoing in his mind. But Olivia wasn't finished. As the hours dragged on, her discomfort with David's presence only deepened. She shifted in her seat, her eyes constantly flicking to him, as if his very existence was a challenge to her place in the world. She continued to make snide remarks, speaking just loudly enough for David to hear, though she pretended not to notice the way he responded, or rather, didn't respond. "I can't believe the state of first class these days," Olivia muttered, loud enough for the few passengers around them to overhear. "I guess they let anyone in now. First class used to be for people of a certain class." The words stung, but David didn't flinch. Instead, he focused on his book, trying to block out the negativity swirling around him. His father's teachings had prepared him for moments like this, when others tried to impose their limitations on him. He wasn't going to let Olivia's words define who he was. The turbulence began suddenly, jolting the plane slightly. And for a moment, Olivia found herself grasping the armrest in surprise. David, on the other hand, was unaffected. He had fastened his seatbelt the moment the sign lit up, just as he had been taught. But the brief movement of the plane seemed to trigger something in Olivia, and her patience finally snapped. David's backpack, which had been resting by his feet, shifted slightly, inching toward Olivia's side of the armrest as the plane dipped. Olivia, looking for any excuse to escalate the situation, immediately grabbed the backpack and shoved it roughly back toward him, as though it had somehow violated her personal space. "Keep your things on your side," she snapped loudly, her voice cutting through the cabin. "This is first class, not the economy section." David, momentarily stunned by her sudden outburst, reached down to retrieve his backpack. His book, which had been perched on his lap, tumbled to the floor with a soft thud. Embarrassment flooded him, but he quickly bent down to pick up his belongings, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the pages of his book. The small accident had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience, yet Olivia's response had made it feel like a personal attack. "I'm sorry," David muttered quietly, his voice barely audible as he straightened the book and tried to regain his composure. Olivia, however, didn't even acknowledge his apology. She sat back in her seat, her body stiff with irritation, her eyes cold and unwavering. She didn't care that David was a child. In her mind, he was simply an inconvenience, an obstacle in her way, an unwanted presence that she was forced to endure. "You're not even taught manners," Olivia muttered under her breath, just loud enough for David to hear. The words landed like a heavy blow. David's chest tightened, and for a brief moment, he struggled to maintain his composure. He had heard things like that before, but it never stopped the sting. He quickly wiped away a tear that had slipped down his cheek, trying to regain his focus. He didn't want to let Olivia's words affect him. His father's voice echoed in his mind again. "You can't control how others treat you, but you can control how you respond." So David wiped away the tear, took a deep breath, and turned back toward the window, trying to find peace in the vast sky outside. But what David didn't know was that the situation was about to escalate in a way that neither he nor Olivia could have imagined. The emotional tension in the air had reached a boiling point, and what was about to happen would change everything. The atmosphere inside the cabin had shifted. What was once a serene and controlled environment of first class had turned into an undeniable tension-filled battleground, though only one side seemed to be aware of the full scale of what was unfolding. Olivia sat rigidly, her discomfort now bordering on a palpable fury, while David remained focused, though internally the sting of the insults had begun to wear on him. He knew his father's lessons well, but even the strongest hearts can feel the weight of words when they are repeated long enough. Olivia's eyes never left David, even as the hours dragged on. She shifted in her seat, her body language an unmistakable sign of irritation. The space between them felt suffocating, like a cold, invisible wall that neither could breach. Every few minutes, her gaze flicked back to him, a silent judgment hanging in the air. To her, David had become an embodiment of everything she resented, someone who did not fit the mold of what she believed was deserving of such luxuries. She had paid the price for this space, and yet it felt as though it was being taken from her by a mere child whose very existence seemed to undermine her position. As the plane cruised steadily through the skies, the situation reached a new level of unease. Olivia's passive-aggressive remarks continued, each one designed to make David feel like an intruder in this domain of the elite. It used to be that first class was for people who earned it, she muttered under her breath, her words dripping with disdain, though she aimed them at no one in particular. Yet she knew David heard them. David's silence had begun to wear on Olivia. She expected some form of reaction from him, anger, perhaps, or at least discomfort. But instead, all she saw was a calm and composed child who didn't seem to care about her insults. To Olivia, that was the final straw. How dare he be so composed? Her anger simmered, and she found herself unable to let go of the idea that she deserved to be free from this discomfort. She needed to break his calmness. She needed to assert her position, to make him understand that he didn't belong here. It happened almost suddenly. A sudden jolt of turbulence rocked the plane, shaking the cabin for a brief moment. David, ever composed, instinctively reached for his juice, holding the glass steady as the seatbelt sign illuminated. But as the turbulence subsided, a small slip occurred. David's backpack, which had been resting by his feet, shifted slightly and nudged Olivia's side. The bag didn't touch her, not really, but Olivia saw an opportunity. With a force that surprised even herself, she grabbed the bag and yanked it toward her, pushing it roughly back toward David. "Keep your things on your side," she snapped, her voice louder than before. Her words were sharp, filled with an intent that was unmistakable. It wasn't about the bag. It was about exerting control, about making David uncomfortable in a way that would match her own irritation. David was startled by the sudden movement, the force with which his bag had been shoved back toward him. His book slipped from his lap, landing on the floor with a soft thud. His body tensed in surprise, and for a moment, the calm composure that had been his shield faltered. His hand trembled as he bent down to pick up his belongings. He straightened the pages of his book, carefully aligning them once again, trying to maintain his dignity in the face of Olivia's aggression. "I'm sorry," David said quietly, his voice barely audible, a soft and sincere apology that spoke volumes of his character. But Olivia wasn't listening. She refused to acknowledge his politeness, her eyes focused on the window, her body stiff with disgust. "Typical," she muttered to herself, loud enough for David to hear. "You're not even taught manners." Her words hit him harder than he wanted to admit. David quickly wiped away a tear that had formed in the corner of his eye, his hand shaking as he did so. The emotional weight of her words was like a physical blow, but he did his best to push it aside, to stay focused. His father's voice echoed in his mind. "You can't control how others treat you, but you can control how you respond." And so, David turned his face back toward the window, determined not to let her words define him. But just as he settled back into his seat, the atmosphere in the cabin grew even more charged. Olivia was not done. She was determined to find another way to make David feel small, to remind him of his place. She was becoming more volatile, more irrational, and the strain in the air was palpable. When the flight attendants came through to offer refreshments, Olivia seized the opportunity. Her eyes narrowed when they approached David first. "I don't want anything," Olivia snapped before they could even offer her a drink. Then she turned to David with a thinly veiled sneer. "Be careful with that," she said, eyeing the juice cup. "I can't have you spilling it again. This suit cost me more than you could ever afford in your lifetime." David's cheeks flushed. He had done nothing wrong. Yet, Olivia's words were like daggers, each one calculated to wound. "Stay composed," he told himself. His father had taught him to be better than this, to rise above it. But even the most well-trained hearts can falter. The tension seemed to escalate with every passing moment, the silence between them stretching longer and longer. Then, the plane hit a brief patch of turbulence, causing David's juice to spill slightly onto Olivia's pristine white sleeve. The droplets, though small, were enough to send Olivia into a complete spiral. She froze for a second, staring at the spill in shock, her face turning red with anger. Then, with a sudden burst of fury, she stood up, causing a few heads to turn. "This is a $5,000 suit," she screamed, her voice high-pitched and shrill. "You have no idea what you've done. You people." Her words were sharp, cutting, filled with venom. "You people don't understand the value of things." David's heart pounded in his chest. The sting of her words was overwhelming. He had tried to remain calm, to keep his composure, but in that moment, the weight of her hatred crushed him. His hand shook as he reached for a napkin, his voice trembling as he offered it to her. "I'm really sorry, ma'am. Please use my napkin." But Olivia was beyond reason. "Sorry doesn't fix this," she spat. "You shouldn't even be in first class. You're not even worthy of being here." And then, with a swift motion, she raised her hand and slapped David hard across the face. The sound of the slap reverberated through the cabin, and for a split second, time seemed to stand still. David's head snapped to the side from the force of the blow, his small body rigid with shock. The passengers around them gasped in horror, their faces filled with disbelief. David's face reddened, a tear slipping down his cheek as he gingerly touched his bruised skin. His body was frozen, his heart racing as he struggled to process what had just happened. But before he could react, James, one of the flight attendants, rushed to their row, his eyes wide with concern as he saw the situation unfolding. The plane fell into a heavy silence. David sat frozen, the shock and pain still coursing through him. But as the flight attendants began to intervene, a powerful voice broke through the tension. It was Marcus Brooks, David's father. His figure appeared at the end of the aisle, tall and imposing, and when his eyes landed on his son, his expression hardened. The sight of his son, red-faced and trembling from the slap, was enough to make his blood boil. He moved forward with deliberate steps, every inch of him exuding authority. "How dare you strike my son?" Marcus's voice was cold, controlled, but laced with fury. Olivia turned pale as she recognized the man standing before her, Marcus Brooks, one of the wealthiest and most influential men in the country. Her stammered apology did nothing to quell the storm that had just been unleashed. Marcus looked down at Olivia with a stern gaze. "You've hurt my son," he said, his voice calm but final. "And I will not let this go. No one, especially a child, should ever be treated this way." Turning to the flight attendants, Marcus gave a simple command. "I want her removed from this flight. Immediately. This is inexcusable." The attendants, though visibly uncomfortable, didn't hesitate. They moved quickly to escort Olivia off the plane, her protestations falling on deaf ears. Marcus's presence, his calm but firm demeanor, had shifted the balance of power in a way that Olivia couldn't have anticipated. As Olivia was led off the plane, the cabin erupted in a mixture of shocked whispers and applause. The passengers who had witnessed the exchange began to speak up, offering support for Marcus's decision. David, though shaken, found solace in his father's presence. Marcus knelt beside his son, gently wiping away the tear that had escaped David's eye. "You did nothing wrong, son," Marcus whispered, his voice soft but full of pride. "You've shown more grace and dignity than anyone else in this situation. I'm proud of you." The lesson from this story was clear. No matter the circumstance, one should never let the actions or words of others define who they are. The true value of a person is found in their character, in how they treat others. And when faced with prejudice and hatred, one can always choose to respond with dignity and integrity, just like David did.